Everybody, this is Shift 8. Our second roundtable is today with Ferda Kolatan. Ferda Kolatan is an architect practicing, and he's the leader of the studio SU11. And he's a both academic and researcher architect, and has an an avant-garde architectural practice, if I might say. We are honored to have him here, and welcome, Ferda. And
thank you. Thank you.
Let's start. And I shall note that when we are not talking, I will close this mic because the sounds interfere. So, thank you for being here.
Should I start? Okay. Well, thank you first of all for inviting me. I came by actually during the opening of the Biennale and looked around, and yeah, I want to congratulate you guys for what you have been doing. And again, it's exciting to participate. So what I'm going to do is I will switch to a short presentation that I have prepared, which is a mix of answering the questions that you have asked of us. And then I will take that toward a provocation, if you will, toward you and the students to hopefully challenge some of their ideas or think about a question that I think is tied to the larger disciplinary issues of architecture, but also relate to how the shows at the Biennale work. And then finally, I just show one project that we've been working on as sort of a, little sort of visual nugget for you guys to see how I'm dealing with the issues that I hope to bring up. Now, I understand there are like about 15 to 20 minutes, and then after that, we will have a Q&A kind of session. So I try to be concise. I tend to go longer usually, so I have to make sure the clock is running. Okay, so let me switch around and then we begin. Okay. So thank you for the introduction. I just wanted to put this up for those of you who do not know what we're doing. The architecture firm I founded together with Eric Schoenberger in New York, and now we have also a third partner, Hart Marlowe, is in Brooklyn, New York. And for those of you who want to know a little more, please go on our website. And as you also had mentioned, I'm a professor, a practice professor, associate practice professor at UPenn, where I've been teaching since 2002. If you're interested in the kind of work I do with my students, I think the best place to see that would be on my Instagram, Ferda K. So those are the things that will allow you to get a little bit more of an idea of what it is we actually do. Now, let me jump right into the questions that you posed. I understand you pose that to all the people you interview. Why does the Biennale exist? What does the Biennale do? For whom does the Biennale exist? So when I looked at these questions, they seem simple, but of course, like everything else, they're not. They're complex and they're difficult to answer. So I basically began by just listing the things that come to my mind when I think about the Biennale without necessarily saying that's what I'm personally interested in. These are just the things that seem to be part of what people expect from the Biennale. So I made a quick list of those things that jumped to my mind, and I ended up with these. The first one would be the Biennale is a defining moment as to where we stand as a discipline. And sort of like, what is it that we're doing? What is the nature of the discipline at this particular moment in time? The second would be Biennale is a compass as to where architecture is heading in the future. There's always some kind of projective element and quality to the Biennale. Where are we going? Where's the world going? How are we going to register our expertise in the days to come, and so forth? The third one would be Biennale is a guide to how architecture solves problems. There are a lot of problems in the world, you know, in Europe, immigration problems, in general, ecology, nature-related problems, etc. So what can architecture do in order to engage these problems directly is, of course, I'd say a rather large topic these days. The Biennale is a communication tool between cultures. That's, I think, one of the original ideas. You bring together people that usually do not hang out too often with each other, and you learn from each other. The Biennale is a provocation to the status quo. So there's a world out there in the real, and then there is the sort of laboratory, the research that's happening in places like the Biennale, where we can sort of, let's say, give ourselves a little bit more space to play with ideas before they're immediately being absorbed by the outside world, and therefore possibly, you know, kind of articulate provocations to the status quo. Then the Biennale is a highlighter of individual talent. This is usually, lately at least, not being brought up a lot, but it clearly, one would assume, is an important element. Biennale is a networking opportunity. This seems to be very obvious on a pragmatic level. And then finally, but rather importantly, Biennale is a hangout and a party. And we all know that often the best ideas are being developed when you have a drink with like-minded people. So these were the things that kind of jumped to my mind. And then when I looked and reread through the list and asked myself, well, which are the ones that I'm the most interested in as we stand today, I narrowed it down to these two. Biennale as a defining moment as to where we stand as a discipline, just because I think that the discipline is going through some kind of crisis. And I would like to sort of take that a little bit as a topic of my talk today. Probably the discipline always went through some kind of crisis, one may assume, but I do think that our crisis is of a particular nature. And I find it important to pose the question to young architects and students in particular. And in that posing of the question, I think the second point will become clear. The Biennale is a provocation to the status quo, because the crisis, of course, always relates back to what we call the status quo, the things as they're being done, why they're being done that way, and is there a different way of thinking about these issues? So these are the two I was thinking about. And then I thought to myself, since I am speaking to students, I would like to bounce back a question or a problem or a provocation to you, and maybe we can even discuss it a little further after the talk is over. And that provocation would be that I'm sort of proclaiming a crisis, and I call it the crisis of the disciplinary paradox. And this paradox basically hinges on two statements. The first statement would be architecture can only survive by maintaining its autonomy. And the second statement would be architecture can only survive by dissolving its boundaries. So I call this the disciplinary paradox, and it's clearly a crisis because they seem to draw into polarizing directions. So the first argument for the first statement, if we look at it a little more clearly, could be summarized very shortly in a nutshell like this. Autonomy relies on a clear set of categories that define and distinguish architecture. These categories can be tied to architecture history or practice or technology or its socio-political impact. But in each case, the expertise of the architect primarily draws from the knowledge produced within the boundaries of these categories. So if we were to pick an image for this, I thought, since this is the Biennale, I look at the Biennale, and I think the first Biennale in 1918 that was using the Arsenale, the presence of the past, by Portoghese, would be an example for the autonomy of architecture, right? I mean, in this image, you see very clearly that the individual projects are all tied together, making a very clear and strong argument that is historical, that brings the idea of history into the present. Of course, this is at the heyday of postmodernism, but there's a clear statement, and it's also a statement that is coming from and through the architectural discipline. It's an expert statement, if you will. Everybody can either like or dislike, enjoy or not enjoy this exhibition, but only the people who really are engaged in architecture will understand what it is we're looking at, and why the things that we're looking at look this particular way, what its references are. It draws from its own architectural heritage. So it's kind of an encapsulated autonomous view where architecture is, and we will go forward by maintaining this particular and specific view toward our own discipline. The counter-argument within the paradox would be this one, to say architecture needs to liberate itself from the anachronistic and defunct shackles of the discipline to embrace the realities of today. Since our current world is characterized by a set of ever-expanding, widely diverse needs, desires, and relations, architecture needs to reflect on this by defining new territories through collaboration and cross-disciplinarity. This is probably registering much more with you guys. That would be my expectation, because it's kind of largely the more current trajectory or tendency that we hear. And I picked this year's, basically the Free Space Biennale. And this is, I think, a promotional image from the day prior of the Biennale, but I think it makes my point pretty clear in comparison to Portuguese's Strada Novissimo. What we see here is basically a place where you can sit, where you can talk, where you can engage with each other. There's very little architecture that we can see. We see a little building here and a little landscape over there and some photos and images in the background, but there is no, let's say, galvanizing architectural image or idea that's being portrayed in this particular photograph. Instead, in the foreground, we see just a lot of people. You may have noticed in the other image, we didn't see any people. So there's a shift towards seeing architecture as a large space within which people interact, they talk to each other, they collaborate, they may very much be from very different kinds of disciplines. It doesn't matter for this image if an architect is looking at it or somebody else is looking at it. We all basically get the major gist of it. Now, I find this really interesting, and it seems to be a natural progression, but I would argue it's not a natural progression, and I would argue that it's basically a real bifurcation that's happening in our discipline. And I'm curious to where it will lead. I have some worries about it, but I also see the inevitability of it. And so that's kind of part of the question I'm posing. And to me, it is certainly a question that is being generated, if not originated, at places like the Biennale, because when we go to these Biennales and we look at it over a period of time, we can register these kinds of changes either as continuities or bifurcations or more abrupt transformations. I want to quickly point to this image, which I like to show in my other lectures as well, because I think it encapsulates in a rather distinct fashion how we usually look at the traditional idea of architecture. In the middle, of course, we have Palladio, the Villa Rotonda, probably one of the most famous buildings in the world for an architect. On the left, we see a medieval depiction, which comes in different variations. It's called the Divine Geometer. And what you see there is the figure of Christ measuring and, by extension, making the cosmos. So what he's holding in his hand is a cosmos, as people believed it to look like in the Middle Ages, with planets, and the Earth is one of those balls in there. But it's important to note that in his hand, he has like a kind of engineering tool, architecture tool, right? I mean, he's like measuring, but in the idea of measuring, of course, we imply a knowledge of the world that comes through some kind of scientific approach. It's a kind of pre-Enlightenment image. if we were to take away the figure of Christ and put a human instead, we would basically get to the Enlightenment, we would get to the Renaissance, we would get to people like Palladio. And the world is no longer the ball in the hands of a divine maker, but the ball becomes, or the sphere becomes the thing that is our world, and we can play with it, we can make it, we can restructure it. So it's, of course, no coincidence that the Villa Rotonda is a perfect circle. It fits a perfect circle in elevation section and in plan as well. The idea of the truth that can be understood, which is centered, which is made for humans, which humans have direct access to through the tools of design and architecture, I think is perfectly made clear in this image. To the right, we see some softening of that. That's what is a rocaille. It's basically things that emerge in the late Baroque and in the age of the Rococo, where our, let's say, trust in a completely centered world is a little bit shaken. Things are being mixed up and hybridized in more interesting ways. It becomes more ambiguous, the thing we look at. So we see already a shift away from sort of the clarity of the categories of what it is to be an architect. But of course, all of these are still very much within what I would call a kind of architectural discipline that is informed by not only geometry, but the deeper ideology of what it means to be in the world and how we reflect that meaning through the practice of design and architecture. Now, I think the crisis in a way, or the paradox is being reflected by a much, much larger crisis, larger paradox. And again, these are, of course, oversimplifications. It's important for you guys to know that they're meant as provocations, but I do think there is a good amount of truth in them. And that would be sort of the crisis of, let's say, of what is real. What we see on the right-hand side, of course, is the Earth, the blue marble. It's a beautiful image taken from one of the Apollo missions. And when this was first shown to people, it really galvanized the cultures in a way that wasn't the case before. It galvanized them in their understanding that they're inhabiting this beautiful blue thing. It's a clear object. It has a clear geometry. We're all on it. We all belong to it. And this was a really important image, not only because we saw the world or the Earth for the first time from the outside, but also in what it meant to be on it and what material reality meant. On the left is a depiction of a network structure. I mean, something along these lines we've all seen. They're kind of ubiquitous these days, or for some time now. That in the late 90s and all the way to today, there has been like a kind of an acceleration of a relational world, right? That things are signals, relations, computational and otherwise, that the world, the material world, is sort of disappearing. And what is becoming much more real is a world of these diverse, yet continuously with each other networked relationships. Now, I do think that there is some relationship between, let's say, this larger paradigmatic shift of what we consider to be the real in the world, and sort of the architectural crisis that moves away from the sort of hard disciplinary notions of yesterday and trying to find a new way of understanding what our role could be. But it does bring up questions, and it does bring up critical questions, for me at least, and here's some of them. At what point will the elastic band of our disciplinary boundaries snap? If that happens, will we be exposed as a profession with no ideological anchor at all? What then will architects of the future do? Will we become service people, consultants, communicators, beautifiers? At that point, would it even matter to ask these questions? So basically, I think it is really crucial for us to understand that the discipline is not a pure fantasy. It is not something that is outside of what it is we're doing, but it is the thing that over a very long period of time has delivered some kind of ideological anchor. And of course, with ideology in this context, I'm just talking about a set of ideas. Right? That's what I mean with ideology, a set of ideas through which you drive the kind of work you do, and these set of ideas are very specific to the discipline of architecture. They cannot be so easily taken from other fields without losing their particular meaning. So what would be my take? And I'm shifting this now slowly to toward the end and the project I want to show before we turn this into the Q&A. But given the critical questions, there are of course also productive questions. And I do believe that we live in an amazingly interesting time, and that all these critical questions hopefully will generate very constructive and very interesting questions, other questions, and potential, if not solutions, potential ways of addressing them. So to me, some of these, what I would call constructive questions, would be these. If the world is in a state of hyperrelationality, what weird constellations emerge from them? How do they actually feel and look? If the world produces hybrids and misfits by mixing and blending once distinct categories, then how can we make these hybrids sensible in a distinctly architectural way? Can we design the paradox? So with that, I want to come to the end of my short talk here, and I want to show one project, not even one project, I want to show one part of one project, which we did in with SU11 in collaboration with 6 of my ex-UPenn Penn Design students. We were asked by Tom Kovac to participate in the kind of Malaysia pavilion that then moved to Venice, and we had like a set of interesting conversations and talks at the Biennale in May this year. So this is a project that we sort of developed and through which we participated in those conversations. I will obviously not go into any depth here, because the point I'm trying to make is really based more on the image or the aesthetic or the idea of the architecture that tries to sort of grapple with the ideas I just brought up. There is a lot of palm oil industry in Malaysia, and what you see here is exactly that. You see these very uncharacteristic or typical, let's say, facilities where palm oil is being collected. The palm oil farming you see basically in those squares, right, all around the facility itself. And it's not a good thing. Palm oil comes with a lot of problems. Again, I'm not going to go too deeply into those, but it's I can tell you, ecologically speaking, it's not a good thing. And it's also seemingly, when we look at the architecture and the way how nature, the industry of palm oil facility and the architecture is developed, it seems very much reinforcing a kind of categorical split of what industry is, what technology is, what nature is, and so forth. And we took that on, and we were interested in coming up with a new kind of palm oil facility that begins to, again, pick up on these antinomies or paradoxes or hybridizations or misfit conditions, whatever you want to call them, and give a face to it, but not in a commentary way or in a cynical way, but in a very straightforward architectural way. So we studied basically how these palm oil facilities work, and it's pretty straightforward. You can see on the left-hand side one of the laborers who is collecting the fruits. You can see the very linear planting structure and system in the background. And on the right-hand side, you see the machines that basically press the oil out of the fruit, and then the fruit is then being sort of discarded and stored and so forth. Anyway, again, Not going to go into the details, but what we did is we basically began by modeling everything we saw in the sort of most accurate way we could. We didn't want to look at any particular hierarchies or relationships, right? We didn't want to say, we already know how this functions. We already know how the individual architectural elements fit into the system that produces palm oil. Instead, we wanted to see all the things in and of themselves. And then we basically began to reassemble them, so to speak, put them together in ways that were still functional, but not following the tradition of the pragmatics of the actual facility. So we came up with these, what I would call hybridized architectural technological facilities. And you can see here that certain elements are machine elements, other elements would be part of the ground. Other elements are the trucks and other movable pieces that are necessary for the facility to function. Things started to fill in, and by doing so, new kinds of relationships, to us at least, emerge between what we understand to be ground, for instance, what we understand to be a machine. If the machine begins to eat itself into the ground, become part of it in order to, let's say, facilitate the collection process of the fruits, which can now be tumbling down in this sort of zipper-like gap into the interior of a cave-like structure, which then turns itself into the facility. These kinds of hybrid misfit conditions were really important to us. So we kept working and kept adding to it. Then the plants became part of it too, not as an afterthought, not as an addition, or not as the actual source for the fruit, but really as an architectural component, if you will. The same goes for the ground, and you can see, I think, in this section pretty well how we were trying to come up with a new conceptual as well as aesthetic way of articulating and expressing this hybrid. And then these things add together. Again, I'm always very interested to keep whatever we do within a very strong architectural language. Things need to be plausible, even if they have not existed in this way. You need to figure out how to make them work. You draw the plans, you render them, you really understand what it is you're dealing with here. And this would be how we would imagine the new kind of palm oil facility would look like, as something that is partially in the ground, where the roof of it may be the palm trees themselves, or the other way around, that the roots of the palm trees are actually the machine. It never exposes itself fully. It never loses an ambiguity between what we consider typically as, let's say, technological, machine-like, or part of the organic world and the nature world. And to me, this would be one example of, building the paradox, if you will. I see I'm already, I think, about more than 20 minutes. I'll stop it here. And open it up for questions.
Thank you for this thought-provoking presentation. It was very interesting, the questions and the arguments. And the arguments about Biennale are very interesting and very timely, I think so. And I think the students also find them interesting. Okay, any questions? Anything to add?
Hi. No, I don't have a question, but Ferda asked some questions. Maybe they might have some ideas on through the project, maybe, or I don't know if you have any. Yeah. Yağmur.
Is it open? Okay. Hello, I'm Yağmur. By the way, it was a very inspiring presentation. Thank you very much. And actually, I've been thinking on the questions that you asked so far. I already wrote a piece about the spectacle of the biennialization. Maybe we can also, because we saw parts of the Biennale itself, maybe we can continue discussing the biennial phenomenon, because you also opened with the questions, why does the Biennale exist? What does the Biennale do? For whom does the Biennale exist? So, and also another point, you were also discussing two arguments. One was architecture can only survive by maintaining its autonomy, and the other one was to dissolve the boundaries in order to open for the new needs of the new communities, in order to create new languages, as I understood. So to me, for example, this exhibition, the main exhibition, was after Arvena's exhibition, like a desperate need in order to make it survive by maintaining its autonomy, like turning back to any opportunities to dissolve in order to open up, like maybe this as a, some takes it as a disappointed attitude, for example, like it is just enclosed into itself in order to maintain itself as autonomous as it was ever happened maybe in the past 5 years. Because, you know, the main theme was the free space, but it was created to me just to be in order to make it for itself, for the discipline. So maybe we can continue discussing it, and also maybe we can, as the second point, continue discussing the biennialization phenomenon for the questions that you already asked and answered, for the questions, what does the Biennale exist? What does the Biennale do? For whom does the Biennale exist? For example, some discusses that the biennialization now, today, created another global topography, like putting other cities. So maybe we can also discuss who decides this topography, what kinds of social relationships or social norms does it reproduce or produce. So, and also others are as a spectacle, okay, but it is also creating some areas for resistance, like opening up new languages, etc. So, for example, Okwi Envezor, the curator of the previous Art Biennale, was saying between the two facts, this is the place where the Biennale exists as the carnivalesque, as Bakhtin says. I said already too much, but I've been writing notes, so maybe I asked 4 things to discuss. I do not know, but you can pick whatever you want.
Yeah, I mean, these are really great observations and important questions. I think, yeah, there were at least 4 questions in there, if not more. I mean, let's see. I mean, certain things seem to be like they're signs of the time. The biennales, right? I mean, there's no doubt about it that we have an inflation of biennales in the world, and that it seems, you know, every other day there's a new one that's popping up somewhere. And it clearly is a result to a certain degree of, again, the times we live in. I mean, I would say the phenomenon of the Biennale fits very much what I tried to summarize in the second statement, right? The one that we have to break free, we have to open up, we have to sort of look beyond the horizons, which up to this point have defined how each individual architect or professional within the discipline of architecture works. And of course, that in and of itself then is generating a new set of issues and problems. You know, the whole idea of the spectacle, when I hear spectacle, of course, I have to think of Guy Debord, or the sort of the spectacle as a kind of late capitalist phenomenon to on the one hand, keep us entertained, and on the other hand, distract us from the sinister issues that are going on, that are being covered up by the spectacle. Now, obviously, this is a rather, it's not old, but there's quite a long trajectory to this particular discussion of the spectacle and, you know, how it relates to our common society. So I would say these are important questions, but I also see them really not so much as novel questions, but more questions that at least since the 60s have been in the making. I guess what I'm personally more interested in is to find out or sort of determine if there is a real sort of what I call bifurcation in the way how the architectural discipline has developed over time. This may be happening since the 60s. It may even go further back toward modernism. But is there still really a need for architecture as a discipline? I mean, that's really as profound a question I can imagine as an architect. And I very seriously wonder if there is a need for architecture. And of course, that makes my heart bleed because I love architecture and I want it to go on and prosper and be all the things it potentially could be. But I think by diversifying to a certain degree, we're also coming to the point where our own expertise becomes hard to measure, right? Because precisely there are so many different kinds of elements within which we're engaging. Now, as a young architect, in your case, I would ask myself very seriously what that question means. And I would try to sort of separate it from, let's say, you know, kind of a, let's say, day-to-day or even year-to-year condition, which we can then talk about and what is the architecture of today, how is it being exhibited, is Alavena's Biennale very different from the Biennale today? Because I would say they're not that different from each other. In one way they are, as you pointed out, no doubt about it. But in the bigger picture, I think they basically are quite similar to each other, pushing into one direction rather than into separate ones. So I don't know. Again, that was a rather sort of, it was probably more like a statement than a direct answer to your questions, but your questions also are not direct questions. They're larger sort of, you know, thoughts that you share, and I think they're really important, but I'm almost like talking about another meta level of what the discipline is today and what the dangers are that are really facing architecture, and what the opportunities are.
Yeah. So the said architecture as a profession in the future, and if we would even need it, and even in the previous slides when you were talking about the autonomy in architecture, I think it boils down to what we define architecture with. I mean, how do you define it? As in, architecture for me has always, I mean, for the time being that I've studied it, it's been about, it's the art of making space. Now, the art of making space as a designer, the people I idolize in art, people I look up to, have always not just kept their artistic expression or some idea of architecture forward, but their architecture has always responded to something. And that is what we see in the history as well. People have priorities, and people have, there are certain set of parameters that have always influenced architecture. When we talk about today's time in compared to the history of architecture, the priorities of today, the problems of today are so much more different than let's just say, even the last century, because we have progressed as a society so much in the last, let's say, 30 years, much more than we progressed before that. And that is why we see a sudden shift of maybe going away from what we believe to be the qualities of this profession, and moving into a hybrid profession where we need to work with people, and our ideologies alone do not really govern how the building turns out to be anymore. And I think it's just it's been a really fast-paced change, and that is why we're still accepting it. But I think architecture has always been about problem solving, has always been um, about responding to the priorities, and the priorities of today are that we need to blend, that we need to sort of, I don't know, like just like in your project. So in your project, you kind of hid the industry itself. So if you actually see, there was no proper elevation, there's no design aesthetics as you talk about it, as we are taught about it as well. But those are the kind of industries that the future needs today. So I think the profession itself is sort of adapting to a new level where we need to mix, where also we need to sort of let go of our ideologies, and if our priorities have changed, we need to learn to change our ideologies at that pace itself as well.
Yeah. Let's say I hear your arguments, but I would not really agree with some of the things you have been saying. And again, this is just an honest disagreement. I'm not saying you're wrong or I'm right at all, because these are not things that can be really addressed in such clarity. But I would make a counter argument. I mean, first of all, I would say that architecture was not always about solving problems. Again, this is also a kind of debate that is as old as architecture itself, right? I mean, for some people, architecture was about creating protection, a tent over your head, the cave, securing you from animals. And that's sort of the beginning of architecture. For other people, architecture begins with the monument. You put a few stones on top of each other, and they become a meaningful place around which you gather, and they sort of anchor your tribe in a sort of particular idea-related way. I personally always was more interested in the latter definition of architecture. Clearly, I'm not saying there isn't a pragmatics of architecture. Yes, there is. If you build, you want to make sure the building doesn't crumble, that the rain doesn't come through the roof and all of it. But if it just were that, I think, you know, you're selling architecture short. Architecture is fundamentally about ideas. And it's not only about reflecting the world around you, but it's also giving to the world through, what architecture is, or the building is. I mean, that's at least traditionally, if you go all the way back to the beginning of architecture, how I would look at it. And even today, I think we can very easily differentiate between architects who adhere to the notion that architecture is meant to solve problems, versus architecture has to provide a vision and some kind of a culture glue, which then, of course, can be applied to solve problems, right? But that, depending on which side you land on this particular argument, I think you think about architecture probably in different ways. If you believe that architecture is about problem solving, I don't think we're in a crisis at all. I think the crisis comes if you do not believe that architecture's primary role is to solve problems, because we could transform architecture into a more sort of specific research, material, engineering profession, which becomes really adept at solving problems in a very straightforward way. I don't see a crisis in there. I don't know if we were successful or other engineers would be better than us, but it would be very clear as a mandate. I think the crisis stems from us not knowing quite any longer what it is that defines us, right? Or because those definitions, as you pointed out very correctly, in this day and age are just much more difficult to understand, let alone maintain. So I agree with you that we cannot go on, and my talk is not sort of kind of asking to regress and go back to a definition of architecture of yesterday. And that would be absurd. I mean, I believe in progress. I believe that we have to go along with the changes of our times. But I just wonder that we are, or basically what I'm proposing is that we think about these issues and don't take them as granted. Not even the discipline of architecture. We should not take that as granted. We need to put work into it in some ways, right? So you said something else. I mean, you said, for instance, and I find that striking, you said to you, architecture is always about making space. In that case, would you, for instance, say that a drawing of architecture would be architecture, or would you define it as something other than architecture?
A drawing of architecture for me, a drawing I believe a drawing is more relevant to us as architects. But when we talk about architecture, I truly believe it is something not just a representation, but an actual manifestation of that representation. Something that is around you, physically present, and that, I mean, I personally believe that is architecture is like that manifestation, that physical manifestation of whatever our ideologies are, and not just a 2D representation of it.
Yeah, no, I agree. No, I agree. I wanted to basically bring that up. The production of architecture is not, hopefully, reduced to a single medium. I think we all would stand in front of certain kinds of architectural drawings and, of course, understand those drawings as architecture, not only as the thing that is representing or as an image of something else. So the real would reside in that particular depiction or drawing of architecture. And I thought it was interesting you brought up space, because it seems to me as an observer of contemporary culture that architecture is turning very, very rapidly into image. These were also ideas that have been sort of floated around for quite some time, but it seems really now in an accelerated fashion. If you think about social media, that's image-based. We consume architecture mostly through images these days. Right? So that to me is a very clear transformation of what architecture is, and the spatiality of architecture, I think, becomes more and more reduced for very few people, and the imagery of architecture is the thing that is seemingly taking over how we communicate ideas about architecture. Right? So that would be another question that is part of that, what I call the meta question. Right? I mean, how can we be image makers and architects at the same time? Can we? What kind of a relationship would that kind of create? So that to me was another interesting point you made when it came to your question. And then finally, maybe the last thing I want to touch on in terms of your question, when you were talking about the aesthetics of the project that I had shown, and you said, well, it's not a classical way of depicting architecture. You're absolutely right. I mean, that's a really important point, because how do we represent these new kinds of what I like to call hybrids with the tools of the architects, and in a way the emergence, or at least the hope for an emergence of a different kind of an aesthetic, to me at least, is very important, because I do believe that we communicate primarily through aesthetics, right? Which is not to say that concepts don't matter, of course they do, but the initial communication that we have, be it through images or drawings or actual buildings and space, is a sensible one. There's no doubt about that in my mind, or at least in the way how I look at the world and architecture. So if there's a shift in the sort of aesthetic sensibilities of how we perceive the world, then of course there has to be a shift in the way how we as architects sort of produce the world, right? So that would be another, I think, interesting idea to ponder about.
Wow, wonderful contributions, and it really provoked our students to think and to contribute. So thank you very much for these questions, answers, questions, and presentations. And thank you for our students who contributed also, and thank you for being with us.
Of course, it was my pleasure. It was my pleasure. Good luck to you guys. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.